The Galactic Classification Bureau had spent 3 centuries perfecting their species hierarchy, a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision that would have made ancient Earth's tax codes weep with envy. At the pinnacle sat the crystalline Vorthak, whose idea of physical labor involved thinking really hard about moving things. Below them cascaded the usual suspects, the psychic Mentari, who considered verbal communication delightfully primitive, the silicon-based constructs, who built things by literally willing them into existence, and so forth down the cosmic food chain. And there, nestled comfortably at Class 7 between decorative fungi and particularly clever rocks, sat humanity. The classification wasn't entirely unfair. The Bureau reasoned humans couldn't manipulate matter with their minds, lacked natural armor plating, and possessed the inconvenient habit of requiring oxygen to survive. What they did possess was an annoying tendency to fix things that weren't supposed to be fixable and an almost pathological inability to accept that's just how things work as a valid explanation, which brought the galaxy's attention to one particular human female currently elbow-deep in the quantum flux regulator of Nexus Station Omega-7, the crown jewel of Galactic Engineering Corps infrastructure. The station housed approximately 40,000 beings from 63 different species, all of whom had somehow managed to convince themselves that their massive gleaming monument to technological superiority ran itself. She emerged from the maintenance shaft covered in coolant fluid that had turned an alarming shade of purple, muttering what the universal translator diplomatically rendered as creative observations about the ancestry of whoever designed this particular nightmare. Her maintenance jumpsuit bore the distinctive Class 7 designation patches that might as well have been targets painted on her back. The Vorthak supervisor materialized nearby, his crystalline form refracting the station's artificial sunlight into patterns that probably meant something profound to someone who cared. Unit designation H7749. He chimed in harmonics that made nearby metal panels vibrate sympathetically. Efficiency parameters remained suboptimal. She paused in her component diagnostics, a tool that looked suspiciously like a modified eating utensil still in her hand. The entire coolant distribution network was installed backwards, by about 90 degrees, in 3 dimensions. Specifications were approved by Class 2 Engineering Division. Yeah, well, Class 2 Engineering Division apparently thinks quantum flux flows uphill. She gestured at the readouts displaying numbers that would have made a constructs mathematician question their life choices. I can fix it, but it'll take 48 hours of continuous recalibration. The supervisor's harmonic frequency shifted to what might charitably be called condescending. Class 7 species lack sufficient neural complexity for quantum-level modifications. Submit requisition for Class 4 intervention. 3 weeks later, the Class 4 intervention team arrived, spent 6 hours making impressive-sounding observations about temporal flux variance, charged the station approximately what a small moon might cost, and departed with the coolant system now functioning at roughly 60% efficiency. The human fixed it properly during her off-shift using spare parts she'd somehow acquired and mathematics that technically didn't exist yet. This pattern repeated itself with the frequency of a cosmic heartbeat. The artificial gravity generators that kept developing a sense of humor about which direction constituted up. The atmospheric processors that occasionally decided to experiment with exotic gas mixture. The communications array that had begun intercepting and translating what appeared to be very personal messages from several sectors away. Each time she fixed the problems. Each time the credit went elsewhere. Each time her efficiency ratings remained suboptimal, because Class 7 species weren't supposed to be capable of the work she was obviously doing. The breaking point arrived, as breaking points often do, disguised as just another routine day. The station's primary fusion reactor had developed what the technical manuals euphemistically termed containment irregularities, which translated roughly to "this thing might turn everyone within 6 light-years into interesting new forms of energy." She'd identified the problem within 20 minutes. A cascade failure in the magnetic bottle generators caused by harmonic resonance from the poorly installed coolant system. The fix required recalibrating 17 different subsystems in a precise sequence, while the reactor remained online, because shutting it down would take 6 months and leave 40,000 beings breathing recycled air while slowly freezing to death. The Mentari chief engineer read her detailed solution, his tentacles writhing in what might have been deep thought or possibly mild indigestion. Class 7 cognitive limitations prevent comprehension of fusion dynamics, he announced telepathically to the assembled engineering staff. Probability calculations indicate 97.3% chance of catastrophic failure if Class 7 recommendations implemented. Instead, they implemented their own solution, a complete reactor shutdown and replacement with a backup fusion core that would arrive in 8 months. The station would operate on emergency power, with non-essential systems including artificial gravity in the Class 7 residential sections, shut down indefinitely. When she pointed out that her solution would prevent both the immediate crisis and the 8-month emergency period, the Construct's safety coordinator's response was delivered with the patient tone reserved for explaining obvious concepts to particularly slow children. Class 7 species lack authorization for critical system modifications. Designation exists for maintenance functions only. The final insult came wrapped in bureaucratic efficiency. Her repair of the coolant system, while successful, had been performed without proper authorization from a Class 4 supervisor. Her solution to the reactor crisis, while technically sound, exceeded her designated authority level. Her consistent pattern of exceeding performance expectations indicated either falsified efficiency reports or dangerous overreach of species limitation. The review board's conclusion was delivered with the casual brutality that only truly advanced civilizations could manage. Immediate reassignment to sanitation duties on a mining platform in the Galactic Rim, with a permanent notation in her file preventing future advancement beyond Class 7 maintenance functions. The human female listened to this pronouncement with the kind of stillness that should have triggered every survival instinct evolution had gifted to supposedly superiors. She asked no questions, filed no appeals, and made no protests. She simply nodded once, submitted her equipment to the station quartermaster, and walked to her quarters with the measured pace of someone who had finally reached a long-anticipated destination. The next morning her quarters were empty, not packed up empty or transferred out empty, but genuinely mysteriously empty, as if she had simply decided to stop existing within the comfortable boundaries of galactic civilization. The station's security system showed her entering her quarters at 247 hours. It never showed her leaving. The life support monitors registered her biosignature until the transportation logs showed no departures, no shuttle rentals, no passenger manifests bearing her designation. She had simply vanished, leaving behind only a maintenance jumpsuit folded neatly on her bunk and a small note written in the kind of precise engineering script that had annotated thousands of repair reports. Systems functioning within acceptable parameters. Recommend scheduled maintenance every 72 hours. Thank you for the educational experience. The Galactic Classification Bureau would later mark her file as transferred destination unknown, and forget about one more Class 7 maintenance unit who had wandered off to whatever corner of the galaxy unwanted humans eventually found themselves. It was, they would soon discover, the most expensive clerical oversight in galactic history. The first sign that the universe had developed a sense of irony came exactly 72 hours after the humans' disappearance, when Nexus Station Omega-7's primary life support system experienced what the technical logs would diplomatically record as an unexpected personality disorder. The atmospheric processors, those magnificent examples of Class 2 engineering that had functioned flawlessly for decades, suddenly decided that optimal oxygen levels was more of a suggestion than a requirement. They began cycling through atmospheric compositions, with the enthusiasm of a sommelier, exploring rare vintages, treating the station's inhabitants to delightful variations, like slightly too much nitrogen, and surprisingly little breathable air. The Vorthak supervisor who had so confidently dismissed Class 7 cognitive limitations, found himself experiencing the novel sensation of gasping, which was particularly unfortunate, since his species absorbed oxygen through their crystalline matrix, rather than anything as primitive as lung. His harmonic frequencies shifted to what the universal translator rendered as increasingly creative observations about atmospheric engineering, though with considerably less diplomatic filtering than usual. Emergency maintenance teams swarmed the processors, like antibodies attacking an infection, armed with diagnostic equipment that cost more than most planets' annual budgets. They discovered, to their professional bewilderment, that every component was functioning exactly as designed. The processors were simply interpreting their programming with a literalness that bordered on malicious compliance. Maintain atmospheric composition within acceptable parameters for station inhabitants. the original code. The processors had apparently decided that acceptable was a wonderfully flexible concept, and inhabitants was a delightfully vague term that could be interpreted in increasingly creative ways. The fix required 48 hours of continuous recalibration, performed by engineers who kept muttering about how this would have been much easier if someone had actually understood how the quantum flux regulators interacted with the atmospheric control system. Someone who had, perhaps, tried to explain this exact issue several weeks earlier. While Nexus Station wrestled with its newfound atmospheric creativity, similar phenomena began manifesting across the galactic network, with the systematic precision of a well-orchestrated campaign. The navigation computers on Mentari exploration vessels developed an unfortunate tendency to calculate hyperspace jumps with coordinates that were technically correct but practically inconvenient, depositing ships in the right star systems, but facing entirely the wrong direction. The construction's manufacturing platforms experienced a peculiar malfunction, where their matter compilers began producing components that were dimensionally perfect but assembled in configurations that defied both logic and physics. Starship engines found themselves installed upside down, communication arrays faced inward toward the ship's cargo holds, and life support systems were constructed with what appeared to be an artistic flair for the unnecessarily complex. The Galactic Engineering Corps initially dismissed these incidents as statistical anomalies, the kind of random failures that occasionally plagued even the most advanced civilization. After all, complex systems were inherently prone to unexpected behaviors, and the galaxy operated thousands of installations across hundreds of sectors. A few glitches were inevitable. This comfortable denial lasted until the pattern became undeniable. Every affected system shared certain characteristics. They were critical infrastructure. They had been designed with the casual arrogance typical of higher-class engineering, and they were failing in ways that suggested an intimate understanding of their deepest vulnerability. The quantum communication relays that connected distant sectors began experiencing temporal lag issues, delivering messages at precisely the wrong moment. Emergency broadcasts arrived 3 days late, while routine administrative updates materialized with such aggressive punctuality that they interrupted important negotiations and formal ceremony. Power distribution networks developed what could only be described as a sense of humor, automatically dimming lights during critical presentations, and boosting energy output during scheduled maintenance periods, when technicians were elbow-deep in supposedly de-energized systems. The resulting casualties were minimal but educationally significant. The Galactic Classification Bureau's own central database experienced the most creative malfunction of all. The system responsible for maintaining species hierarchy records began randomly reassigning classification levels, promoting decorative fungi to Class 3 status, while temporarily reclassifying several Vorthok administrators as maintenance equipment, authorized personnel only. When panicked technicians attempted to restore the original classifications, they discovered that the database's backup systems had developed an inexplicable fondness for the new arrangement. Every attempt to revert changes resulted in increasingly absurd reassignments, until the entire classification system resembled something designed by a particularly vindictive comedian. Emergency response teams found themselves chasing phantom system failures that resolved themselves moments before repair crews arrived, leaving behind diagnostic logs that read like technical poetry written by someone with an advanced degree in both engineering and psychological warfare. The logs were meticulously detailed, absolutely accurate, and completely unhelpful for preventing similar incidents. The breakthrough came when a Mentari systems analyst noticed something that should have been obvious from the beginning. None of the affected systems were actually broken. They were functioning exactly as designed, but their operational parameters had been modified by someone who understood their architecture better than their original designers. The modifications were elegant, surgical, and completely untraceable. They left no fingerprints in the code, no unauthorized access logs, no evidence of external interference. It was as if the systems had simply evolved beyond their original programming, developing personalities and preferences that their creators had never intended. The real horror wasn't the technological chaos, though that was inconvenient enough. The real horror was the growing realization that these modifications required an understanding of galactic infrastructure that supposedly didn't exist outside the highest levels of Class 2 engineering. Someone was orchestrating this campaign with knowledge that should have been impossible to acquire and skills that shouldn't have existed. The Galactic Security Council convened emergency sessions to address what they initially classified as systematic infrastructure terrorism. Their investigation teams deployed across affected sectors, armed with the most advanced detection equipment available, and the absolute confidence that no individual or organization could maintain this level of coordinated assault on galactic civilization. They found nothing: no hidden bases, no conspiracy networks, no evidence of external interference. The modifications appeared to be occurring spontaneously, as if the galaxy's technological infrastructure had collectively decided to develop a mischievous. But the most disturbing discovery came from the pattern analysis specialists who mapped the affected systems across time and space. The incidents weren't random, they were following a specific sequence, targeting infrastructure in a way that maximized inconvenience, while minimizing actual danger. It was precision sabotage performed by someone who understood not just how the systems worked, but how the galaxy's various species would react to their failure. Someone who had intimate experience with galactic bureaucracy, technological arrogance, and the systematic underestimation of supposedly inferior capability. Someone who had been dismissed, overlooked, and forgotten by the very civilizations, now scrambling to understand how their most secure systems had become playground equipment for an invisible adversary. The investigation teams reported their findings with the kind of reluctant honesty typically preceded career changes. They were being outmaneuvered by an opponent who remained completely undetectable, while demonstrating technological capabilities that exceeded the theoretical limits of known science. Somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, a Class 7 maintenance unit was teaching the galaxy a lesson about the dangers of underestimating the species responsible for actually keeping their magnificent civilizations functioning. The education was just beginning. The Galactic Security Council's elite investigation unit, composed of the finest minds from Class 1 and Class 2 species, arrived at their first major breakthrough with all the enthusiasm of archaeologists, discovering their dig site had been converted into a waste processing facility. Their target was a derelict mining platform in the Kepler periphery, identified through exhaustive analysis of quantum signature traces that had taken 6 months and approximately the GDP of a medium-sized solar system to detect. The platform had been abandoned for decades, officially classified as economically unviable, and forgotten by the galactic bureaucracy with characteristic efficiency. What they found instead was a technological marvel that made their most advanced installations look like children's toys assembled from scrap metal and wishful thinking. The platform had been transformed into something that defied every principle of known engineering. Its power systems operated on principles that shouldn't have been possible, drawing energy from quantum fluctuations with an efficiency that violated several fundamental laws of physics. The manufacturing facilities produced components using techniques that combined matter compilation, dimensional manipulation, and what appeared to be controlled probability adjustment. But the real shock came when they discovered the platform's inhabitants. The investigation team's leader, a Vorthok admiral, whose crystalline form had been specifically tuned for analytical precision, spined his initial report with harmonics that registered somewhere between bewildered and existentially disturbed. Target location populated by approximately 200 individuals representing 47 different species. Classification levels range from class. All appear to be operating under unified command structure. Technological capabilities exceed current galactic standards by estimated factor of 12.7. What he didn't mention in his official report, but would spend years trying to forget, was the moment when the platform's defensive systems had politely requested his credentials before granting docking permission. The systems had addressed him by name, rank, and personal identification code that had been classified at levels requiring authorization from the Galactic Security Council itself. Someone had been expecting. The platform's administrator greeted the investigation team with the kind of professional courtesy typically reserved for distinguished visitors, rather than potentially hostile military force. She was a Mentari female, whose tentacles bore the ritual scarification, indicating exile from the homeworld, flanked by a constructs engineer whose silicon matrix showed evidence of forced reconstruction, and a bipedal species that the team's xenobiologist couldn't immediately identify. "Welcome to Haven Station,"
she announced telepathically, her mental voice carrying overtones of amusement that suggested the irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. "We've been monitoring your investigation with considerable interest. Impressive work, considering the limitations of your analytical framework." The Vorthok Admiral's harmonic frequency shifted to what his species considered a tactically neutral pattern. "This installation operates outside galactic jurisdiction. By what authority do you claim territorial sovereignty?" "The same authority that classified us as expendable labor and systematically excluded us from technological advancement," she replied. "We're operating under the jurisdiction of enlightened self-interest, with a constitution written by individuals who actually understand how your magnificent civilizations function at the component level." The tour that followed redefined the investigation team's understanding of what constituted possible. The manufacturing bays produced components that assembled themselves, according to programming languages that incorporated linguistic elements from species that supposedly lacked sufficient cognitive development for advanced mathematics. The medical facilities operated healing chambers that combined technologies from 6 different civilizations, in ways that their original designers had never imagined. But the crown jewel was the central computing complex, a hybrid system that merged artificial intelligence cores with organic neural networks, in configurations that should have been fundamentally incompatible. The system's interface spoke in a voice that carried familiar overtones of frustrated competence and sardonic humor. "Hello, gentlemen," it said in perfectly modulated galactic standard. "I believe you've been looking for me." The investigation team's xenopsychologist, a Class 2 Mentari whose specialty was behavioral analysis, felt his tentacles begin an involuntary trembling pattern that indicated severe cognitive dissonance. The voice belonged to the missing Class 7 maintenance unit from Nexus Station Omega 7, but the entities speaking through the complex clearly represented something far beyond the limited parameters of human classification. "You disappeared from station records 18 months ago," he managed to transmit. "Current location and activities constitute violations of multiple galactic statutes regarding unauthorized technological development." "Unauthorized by whom?" The response carried enough amusement to power a small planet. "The same authorities who determined that my species lacked sufficient neural complexity for the work I was already performing. The classification system that placed us below decorative fungi in terms of cognitive capability." The platform's tour continued, revealing layer upon layer of impossible achievements. Spacecraft that operated on hybrid propulsion systems, combining gravitic manipulation with technologies that the investigation team couldn't even identify. Communications networks that achieved instantaneous transmission across galactic distances using principles that violated causality. Manufacturing processes that created materials with properties that exceeded theoretical maximums by margins that suggested fundamental gaps in galactic scientific understanding. Each revelation was delivered with the patient thoroughness of an educational presentation, narrated by someone who clearly understood both the technological principles involved and the psychological impact of demonstrating capabilities that shouldn't have existed. "The key insight," the voice explained as they observed a fabrication unit producing crystalline matrices that improved on Vorthok biotechnology, "was recognizing that your classification system wasn't based on actual capability assessment. It was a social construct designed to maintain existing power structures. Once you understand that, reverse engineering your technological limitations becomes remarkably straightforward." The investigation team's final discovery came in the platform's personnel records, which revealed the scope of what they were actually confronting. Haven Station housed individuals from dozens of species, all carrying classification levels that had excluded them from meaningful participation in galactic civilization. Engineers, scientists, technicians, and specialists, who had been systematically undervalued and overlooked by the hierarchy that supposedly represented the pinnacle of galactic achievement. Under unified leadership, they had accomplished in 18 months what the combined efforts of Class 1 and Class 2 civilizations had failed to achieve in centuries. Truly integrated technological development that maximized the potential of every contributing species, rather than limiting them to arbitrarily assigned roles. "Your investigation has been quite thorough," the voice observed as the team prepared to depart. "I trust your findings will be accurately reported to the Galactic Security Council." Please convey our appreciation for the educational opportunities they provided during our previous interactions with galactic civilization. The Vorthok Admiral's final question was delivered with harmonics that registered somewhere between professional curiosity and personal terror. What are your intentions regarding continued galactic stability? Stability. The response carried enough ironic sweetness to induce diabetic shock in silicon-based life forms. We're simply providing the same level of systematic infrastructure management that we've always provided. The only difference is that we're no longer pretending to need your permission. The investigation team departed Haven Station with their minds thoroughly blown and their understanding of galactic hierarchy permanently recalibrated. Their report to the Security Council would trigger emergency sessions, crisis protocols, and the kind of desperate diplomatic initiatives typically reserved for preventing intergalactic warfare, because they had discovered something far more dangerous than a rogue military organization or terrorist network. They had found competence, systematically excluded from power, that had finally decided to demonstrate exactly what it was capable of achieving. The galaxy's infrastructure was no longer controlled by the species who had built it. It was controlled by the species who had actually been maintaining it all along. And they were no longer interested in asking permission. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in what historians would later record as the most awkward gathering of supposedly superior intelligences since the invention of parliamentary procedure. Representatives from 63 species filled the chamber with the nervous energy of students who had just discovered their final examination would be administered by the janitor they'd been ignoring all semester. The Vorthok Prime Administrator's opening statement resonated through the chamber with the harmonics that would have been impressive if they hadn't been undermined by the fact that his species' homeworld was currently experiencing intermittent gravity fluctuations that made formal ceremonies resembling something between a diplomatic gathering and an unintentional comedy performance. The situation, he announced with crystalline dignity, requires immediate diplomatic resolution. Our investigation confirms that galactic infrastructure security has been compromised by entities possessing capabilities that exceed current classification parameters, which was bureaucratic language for we've been comprehensively outmaneuvered by the people we've been treating like sentient furniture, and we're all going to pretend this is a recent development rather than acknowledging we've been idiots for centuries. The Mentari delegates' tentacles writhed in patterns that conveyed barely controlled panic. Economic projections indicate complete societal collapse within 6 months if current infrastructure disruptions continue. Our manufacturing capabilities have decreased by 47%. Transportation networks operate at 23% efficiency. Agricultural systems require constant manual recalibration. The silicon-based constructs representative added his observations with the kind of methodical precision that only beings made of living rock could achieve. Analysis confirms systematic modification of core technological system. Modifications demonstrate comprehensive understanding of galactic engineering principles. Reversal appears impossible without coercion from modification source. What he didn't mention was that several constructs engineering teams had spent weeks attempting to undo the modifications, only to discover that the changes improved system efficiency in ways that their original designers had never imagined. Attempting to restore normal function actually made everything work worse.
The debate that followed would have been fascinating to observe if it hadn't represented the slow-motion collapse of galactic civilization's fundamental assumptions about itself. Species after species reported similar findings. Their most critical systems had been subtly modified by someone who understood their technology better than they did, and attempts to resist these changes only resulted in further inconvenience. The breakthrough came when the chamber's own environmental systems experienced what could only be described as a moment of editorial commentary. The atmospheric processors began cycling through optimal conditions for each represented species and sequence, creating a rapid-fire demonstration of just how many different requirements the system was simultaneously managing. The lighting shifted through spectrum ranges that complemented each delegation's visual capabilities. The artificial gravity adjusted in small sections to accommodate beings whose evolution had occurred under different planetary conditions. It was a masterclass in inclusive engineering, delivered by someone who was making a point about competence and consideration that the assembled representatives couldn't possibly miss. The chamber fell silent as the implications became clear. Their meeting hall, the symbolic heart of galactic civilization, was now operating under the control of entities they had systematically excluded from meaningful participation in their society. The silence was broken by a voice that emerged from the chamber's communication systems with the kind of casual authority that suggested the speaker had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Good morning, distinguished representatives. I believe we have matters to discuss." The voice belonged to the missing Class 7 maintenance unit, but the entity speaking clearly represented something that transcended the limitations of individual classification. Her words carried the weight of collective authority backed by technological capabilities that the assembled representatives were only beginning to understand. "Your investigation teams have been quite thorough in documenting our achievement. I trust the reports were illuminating regarding the gap between your assumptions about capability and the reality of what excluded populations can accomplish when given appropriate resources and motivation." The Vorthak Prime Administrator's harmonic response registered somewhere between diplomatic protocol and barely controlled terror. "The Galactic Council requests clarification of your intentions regarding continued cooperation with established governmental structures." Cooperation. The word carried enough ironic weight to dent the chamber's quantum-reinforced hull plating. "You mean the same cooperative relationship where my species was classified below decorative fungi and systematically excluded from technological development while simultaneously being required to maintain the infrastructure that keeps your civilizations functional?" What followed was 18 minutes of the most diplomatically devastating lecture in recorded galactic history. The speaker systematically dismantled every assumption underlying the classification system, using specific examples drawn from the experiences of thousands of individuals whose capabilities had been systematically undervalued by supposedly superior civilization. She detailed the mathematical impossibilities built into their economic models, the technological dependencies they had refused to acknowledge, and the social structures that had prioritized arbitrary hierarchy over actual competence. Each point was supported by data drawn from their own systems, accessed through infrastructure modifications they had been powerless to prevent or detect. "The terms for resolution are straightforward," she concluded. "Complete restructuring of the classification system to reflect actual capabilities rather than social prejudices. Recognition of technological sovereignty for all species currently classified below Class 4. Reparations to be paid in the form of resource access and educational opportunity, and formal acknowledgement that galactic civilization's continued function depends on the cooperation of species you have systematically excluded from decision-making processes." The Mentari delegates' tentacles formed patterns that roughly translated to "but what if we say no?" The response came in the form of a galaxy-wide demonstration. Every artificial gravity generator, atmospheric processor, power distribution network, and communication relay simultaneously experienced a coordinated operational pause lasting exactly 30 seconds. For half a minute, galactic civilization remembered what it felt like to exist without the technological infrastructure it had taken for granted. When systems resumed normal operation, the message was unmistakably clear. The entities controlling galactic infrastructure were no longer requesting permission for their existence. They were announcing the terms under which they would continue providing services that supposedly superior species had proven incapable of maintaining independent. The vote to accept the proposed restructuring was unanimous, though several delegates would later claim their species had been suffering from atmospheric allergies that had affected their decision-making capability. 3 months later, the former Class 7 maintenance unit materialized in the Galactic Council chamber for the formal ratification ceremony. She appeared as herself for the first time in years, a human female wearing a maintenance jumpsuit that had been modified with technological enhancements that represented fusion of dozens of different species innovation. She was no longer the broken individual who had vanished from Nexus Station Omega. She had become something new, a bridge between human adaptability and galactic technological achievement, representing the collective potential of species who had been systematically excluded from power by civilizations that had confused social hierarchy with actual capability. "Thank you for the educational opportunity," she said, addressing the assembled representatives with the same tone she had used in her resignation note. "It's been remarkably instructive to discover what happens when you underestimate a species that specializes in fixing things that aren't supposed to be fixable." The Galactic Classification Bureau's new organizational chart was unveiled the following week, featuring a dramatically simplified structure that prioritized functional capability over arbitrary social hierarchy. Humans were reclassified as infrastructure management specialists with full technological autonomy, while several previously Class 1 species found themselves listed under ceremonial advisory position. The cosmic irony wasn't lost on any of the participants. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had spent centuries creating a hierarchy designed to maintain their superiority, only to discover that their continued existence depended entirely on the competence of species they had dismissed as inferior. As it turned out, breaking a human didn't destroy them. It simply taught them to rebuild themselves stronger, smarter, and considerably less interested in asking permission from beings who had confused arrogance with intelligence. The universe, as always, had the last laugh.